Hello, everyone. I am your host, Linda.
And me, George.
So let's jump right in. Many of our listeners are non-native speakers who often feel overwhelmed when conversing with native speakers. What would you say is one of the primary challenges they face? And how can they better prepare themselves for these interactions?
That's a fantastic question, Linda. One of the most significant challenges is the speed at which native speakers often communicate. Native speakers can use idiomatic expressions, slang, and contractions, which can create a barrier for non-native speakers. To prepare for these interactions, I recommend that learners immerse themselves in the language as much as possible. This can include watching English movies or TV shows, listening to podcasts, or even joining conversation clubs. The goal is to familiarize themselves with the natural rhythm and flow of the language.
Immersion really helps in picking up those nuances. Speaking of nuances, how important is it for learners to understand cultural references or context that native speakers might assume everyone knows? Can you provide some examples of how this affects communication?
Great point, Linda. Understanding cultural references is crucial. Native speakers often rely on shared knowledge or experiences. Things like popular movies, historical events, or even viral internet trends, for instance. If someone references a famous scene from a movie like Titanic, they might expect the listener to understand the underlying emotions or humor related to that scene. A non-native speaker who isn't familiar with the movie might miss out on that entire layer of meaning. To bridge this gap, I suggest learners take time to study aspects of culture, history, and current events related to English-speaking countries. Engaging with content that explains these references can also be very helpful.
That's really insightful. Now, let's talk about listening skills. Many learners report that they struggle to catch everything being said. What strategies would you recommend for improving listening comprehension when conversing with native speakers?
Listening comprehension is indeed a common hurdle. One effective strategy is to practice active listening. This means not just hearing the words, but really focusing on the speaker's intent and emotions. Encouraging learners to ask clarifying questions is another great technique. For example, if someone says something that's hard to follow, they can say, "Could you elaborate on that?" Or, "I'm not quite sure I understand. Can you give me an example?" Additionally, using resources like TED Talks or YouTube videos with subtitles can help learners see the words while hearing them spoken, reinforcing their understanding.
Those are excellent strategies. I love the idea of active engagement. Moving on to spoken communication, many non-native speakers worry about their accents or pronunciation. What advice do you have for them to feel more confident when speaking with native speakers?
This is a topic that comes up frequently, Linda. First and foremost, I encourage learners to embrace their accents. Accents are a part of their identity and cultural background. Instead of trying to eliminate their accents completely, they should focus on clarity. Practicing pronunciation with tongue twisters or using apps that focus on phonetics can be beneficial. Role-playing scenarios where they practice common conversational situations can also build their confidence. The key is to remember that communication is about conveying meaning, not just perfect pronunciation.
That's such a positive take. Confidence plays a huge role in effective communication. Now, what role do you think humor plays in conversations between native speakers and non-native speakers? How can learners navigate this often tricky aspect of language?
Humor is indeed a complex area. It can serve as a great icebreaker, but it can also lead to misunderstandings. Native speakers often use humor that relies on wordplay, puns, or cultural references, which can confuse non-native speakers. To navigate this, I suggest that learners pay attention to humor in context. Notice when people laugh and try to understand why. It can also be helpful to ask native speakers to explain jokes or humorous remarks. This not only clarifies the meaning, but also deepens their understanding of cultural nuances.
This is a great approach to demystifying humor. Can you share some tips for our listeners who are eager to improve their understanding of native English speakers in real-life situations?
Oh yes. First, I would recommend practicing regularly. Consistency is key. Engage in conversations as often as possible, even if they're brief. Second, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Every error is an opportunity to learn and improve. Third, seek feedback, whether from friends, language partners, or teachers. Finally, try to stay curious and open-minded. Language is a living thing, and being adaptable will serve them well in their communication journey.
Many learners express frustration when they try to follow conversations, particularly when they feel like sounds are being skipped or words are being swallowed. Can you elaborate on why this phenomenon occurs and what learners can do to tackle it?
Certainly, Linda. The experience of feeling like words are disappearing is quite common, and it largely stems from a linguistic concept known as linking. When native speakers talk, they often connect words in ways that create a fluid flow, making it sound like they're producing one long word instead of distinct words. This is especially noticeable within what I call thought clusters, which are groups of words that naturally belong together, often without pauses. For instance, phrases like, "What are you doing?" can sound like, "What are you doing?" when spoken quickly. And to tackle this, I recommend that learners focus on identifying key words within sentences. By honing in on the main ideas rather than trying to catch every single word, they can significantly improve their comprehension. Additionally, imitating native speech patterns can be beneficial. This might involve listening to audio clips and repeating them, paying close attention to how certain sounds blend together, linking consonants with vowels, for example.
That's a fascinating insight. So if linking is a crucial part of this, could you explain a bit more about how these linking rules work in practice? Perhaps you could give us a few examples to illustrate how consonants and vowels interact in natural speech.
Of course, one of the most common linking scenarios occurs when a word ending in a consonant is followed by a word that begins with a vowel. For example, if we take the phrase turn off pronounced quickly, it can sound like turn off. Similarly, in the phrase go on, it can almost sound like guan. Another example is when a word ends in a vowel sound, and the next word starts with a vowel sound. In this case, native speakers might insert a slight glide between them. For instance, I am often comes out as I yam in rapid speech. To practice these linking rules, I encourage learners to listen to native speakers in context, such as in movies, podcasts, or conversations, and pay special attention to how these connections are made. They can also practice with specific sentences, breaking them down to identify the linking patterns at play.
Those examples really help clarify the concept of linking. Now, many learners may feel overwhelmed by these rapid speech patterns and might lose confidence in their ability to participate in conversations. What advice do you have for those who are feeling discouraged or anxious about understanding native speakers?
It's entirely normal to feel overwhelmed, but I assure learners that building confidence takes time and practice. First, I suggest they start with listening exercises that suit their current level, gradually increasing the difficulty as they improve. Listening to slower speech initially can provide a solid foundation before moving on to faster-paced conversations. Additionally, I recommend engaging in practice conversations with language partners or tutors who can provide constructive feedback. This not only reinforces their listening skills, but also allows them to experience real-time dialogue. Additionally, I recommend engaging in practice conversations with language partners or tutors who can provide constructive feedback. This not only reinforces their listening skills, but also allows them to experience real-time dialogue. Encouragement is key here. Learners should remind themselves that it's okay to ask for clarification. Phrases like, "Could you repeat that, please?" or "I didn't catch that. Could you say it again?" can be very helpful. This not only gives them a chance to understand better, but also builds their conversational skills.
Those are excellent strategies. It sounds like a combination of practice, exposure, and self-advocacy can go a long way. What about specific techniques learners can use to practice understanding linking in their own time?
Great question, Linda. One effective technique is shadowing, where learners listen to a short audio clip, ideally of native speakers, and then immediately repeat what they hear, trying to match the rhythm, intonation, and linking patterns. This can help them internalize how native speakers communicate. Another useful method is to use transcripts or subtitles. Learners can listen to a podcast or watch a video with subtitles, following along as they hear the speech. This dual input approach helps them connect the sounds they hear with the written words, reinforcing their understanding of linking. Finally, I encourage learners to create their own linking practice exercises. They can record themselves reading sentences that include common linking patterns and then listen back to identify areas for improvement. This self-assessment can be incredibly valuable for building awareness of their own speech and comprehension.
These are great practical tips. Do you have any thoughts or encouragement for our listeners who are on this journey to understanding fast speech from native English speakers?
I want to remind learners that language acquisition is a marathon, not a sprint. Progress may feel slow sometimes, but every bit of practice contributes to their overall understanding. Embracing the challenges, celebrating small victories, and being patient with themselves will lead to significant improvements over time. Also, I encourage them to engage with native speakers as much as possible, whether that's through language exchange programs, online platforms, or local meetups. Real-life practice is invaluable, and remember every conversation is an opportunity to learn. And the more they expose themselves to rapid speech, the easier it will become to understand it.
That's a crucial topic. Many learners express frustration when they try to follow conversations with native speakers, as they often feel that phrases sound like one long word. What are some of the main reasons for this phenomenon, and how can learners better prepare themselves to understand these connected speech patterns?
Excellent question, Linda. The phenomenon you're referring to is largely due to how native speakers naturally link words together in conversation, a process known as connected speech. This can make it difficult for learners to catch every word because sounds often blend together, and certain sounds may even drop out entirely. This can be confusing, especially for learners who have been trained to recognize individual words rather than phrases. To prepare for this, I recommend that learners focus on key words within sentences, emphasizing important words like said, concluded, and came out. By focusing on these key elements, they can understand the overall meaning of the conversation, even when some words are less clear or omitted.
That makes perfect sense. Focusing on keywords can help learners pick up the essential meaning. Can you elaborate on some specific practice sentences that demonstrate these connected speech patterns? How might learners recognize and produce these patterns in their own speech?
Let's take a few examples. Consider the sentence, "I want to go to the store." In rapid speech, this may sound like, "I wanna go to the store." Here, want to becomes wanna, and to becomes ta. Another example could be, "Did you eat yet?" which can sound like, "Did ya eat yet?" In this case, did you is contracted into did ya. To help learners practice, I suggest they read these sentences aloud, focusing on the linking and reductions. They can also try creating their own sentences using similar structures. For instance, they might experiment with "I'm going to" becoming "I'm gonna." By recognizing these patterns and practicing them, learners can become more comfortable with connected speech, allowing them to produce it more naturally in their conversations.
Those examples are incredibly helpful. Now let's talk about listening skills. Many learners struggle with understanding native speakers, especially when they hear these connected speech patterns. What listening practice techniques would you recommend for improving comprehension in this area?
Great point, Linda. One effective technique is to watch videos without captions first, allowing learners to focus solely on the sounds and rhythms of the speech. After that, they can rewatch the same videos with captions to clarify their understanding. This approach helps them train their ears to pick up on the nuances of connected speech, while also providing a reference point for any missed words. Another valuable practice is to listen to podcasts or audio clips that feature native speakers. Learners can listen multiple times, gradually increasing their comprehension with each pass. I also recommend using apps that provide transcripts of spoken language so learners can read along while listening. This dual exposure reinforces their understanding of how words connect in natural speech.
Those techniques sound very effective. Now let's dive deeper into the specific linking rules. Could you explain how certain consonants may disappear in connected speech, and how this can affect a learner's understanding?
Absolutely, Linda. One important linking rule to remember is when the final consonant of one word is the same as the initial consonant of the next word. In such cases, native speakers often only pronounce one of those consonants. For example, in the phrase "stop talking," it's common to hear it pronounced as "stop talking." The T sound is linked, and the final T in stop isn't fully articulated. Additionally, certain consonants can drop out entirely. In phrases like "next day," the T in next can become very soft, almost disappearing, which may make it sound like next day. To practice this, I encourage learners to listen for these patterns in natural speech and to mimic them. They can also make a list of common phrases where this occurs and practice saying them out loud, paying attention to how the sounds blend together.
That's such an important observation. Understanding these linking rules can really enhance a learner's ability to understand and participate in conversations. As we near the end of our discussion, do you have any final thoughts or encouragement for our listeners who are on the path to mastering these connected speech patterns?
I want learners to remember that mastering connected speech takes time and persistence. It's important not to get discouraged by occasional misunderstandings. Language learning is a gradual process. I encourage them to stay curious and to view every conversation as an opportunity to learn. Engaging with native speakers, whether through conversation exchanges or listening to media, will build their confidence and familiarity with these patterns. Lastly, I urge them to embrace the challenges they face, as each hurdle crossed brings them one step closer to fluency.
One common issue I hear from students is that they often focus too much on individual words, trying to translate each one. Can you explain why this approach can be counterproductive and how learners can shift their focus to improve their comprehension?
Absolutely, Linda. Focusing on individual words can lead learners to miss the bigger picture. When native speakers converse, they often link words together, and this can cause the sounds to change. For example, the phrase good day can sound like one long word when spoken quickly by a native speaker. In this case, we only pronounce one D sound, effectively merging those two words into a single unit. When learners fixate on individual sounds, they risk missing out on these transitions. Instead, I recommend that they listen for phrases as complete units rather than dissecting each word. By doing this, they can better appreciate how the sounds blend together and how meaning is conveyed through these connections.
That's a great point. It sounds like learners really need to attune their ears to how words interact. Speaking of that, could you elaborate on how native English speakers often link sounds together? What are some specific examples, and how can learners practice recognizing these links?
Linking occurs when two words are pronounced in a way that connects their sounds. For instance, in the phrase, "What are you doing?" native speakers might say it as, "What are you doing?" Here, the words blend, and the T in what gets softened. To practice this, learners can listen to short audio clips of native speakers and pay close attention to how words connect. They can even try to imitate these phrases, practicing saying them quickly to get used to the sounds blending together. This kind of practice will help them become more comfortable with the natural rhythm of spoken English.
Those examples really illustrate how important linking is. Now, let's talk about sentence stress. Why is it important for learners to pay attention to which words are stressed in a sentence, and how does this affect their understanding?
Great question, Linda. In spoken English, certain words carry more weight than others, which creates rhythm and intonation. Typically, the stressed words are nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, essentially the words that convey the main meaning of a sentence. For example, in the question, "Can you pay by cash?" the words pay and cash are stressed, as they are crucial to the meaning. By focusing on these stressed words, learners can grasp the main idea of what is being communicated much more quickly. When they listen, they should try to identify which words are emphasized, as this can guide them toward understanding the overall message despite any reductions or weak forms present in the sentence.
That's such a valuable technique. Now, you mentioned earlier the importance of intensive and extensive listening practice. Can you explain what these terms mean and how learners can incorporate them into their study routines?
Yes, of course. Intensive listening involves focusing deeply on shorter audio clips, typically around 30 to 60 seconds, where the goal is to understand as much detail as possible. This practice is excellent for honing in on sentence stress and picking out keywords. On the other hand, extensive listening refers to engaging with longer audio materials, such as podcasts, films, or TV shows, where the focus shifts to understanding the main ideas rather than every single word. By combining both types of listening practice, learners can develop a well-rounded approach. For intensive listening, they should concentrate on the rhythm and stress patterns, while extensive listening allows them to see how these elements play out in longer contexts. This dual approach mirrors how native speakers process language, giving learners a more authentic experience.
Both types of listening sound essential for developing comprehension. Now, let's talk about chunks. How can recognizing and learning chunks improve a learner's ability to understand spoken English? And what are some examples of common English chunks?
Recognizing chunks is incredibly helpful because it allows learners to process phrases as single units rather than dissecting them into individual words. Chunks are often idiomatic expressions, phrases, or grammatical structures that we use in everyday speech. For instance, "have a good day" is a common chunk that we use as a whole. Other examples include phrases like "I'd like to," pronounced as "I'd like to," and "can you," which sounds like "can you." By training their ears to pick out these chunks, learners can understand native speakers more effectively. To practice, learners should listen for these chunks in conversation. And when they hear them, They should try to repeat them as a single sound. This practice not only enhances listening skills, but also helps learners produce more natural-sounding speech with correct intonation.
That's a great strategy. Now, let's discuss weak forms and contractions. How do these elements affect how learners should approach listening to native speakers, and what should they be aware of?
Weak forms and contractions are crucial for understanding spoken English, especially because they often go unnoticed. Many English words have both strong and weak forms, particularly function words like prepositions and auxiliary verbs. For instance, the word to can be pronounced as ought to when stressed, but in everyday speech, it usually becomes tak. Recognizing these weak forms is vital because most of the time speakers use the weak form. Additionally, contractions like I'm for I am or you're for you are common in spoken English, and learners should familiarize themselves with these as well. When learners listen, they should be on the lookout for these weak forms and contractions, as they will significantly aid their comprehension. The mistake many students make is focusing too much on strong forms, which can lead to misunderstandings.
Those are such important insights. It sounds like understanding weak forms and contractions can really enhance a learner's listening skills. As we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or encouragement for our listeners who are eager to improve their understanding of native English speakers?
I want to remind learners that improving their listening skills is a journey, and it takes consistent practice and patience. Embrace the challenges you face as they are opportunities for growth. Focus on the techniques we discussed today, like listening for chunks, recognizing weak forms, and paying attention to sentence stress. Engaging with native speakers, whether through conversation exchanges or by consuming media in English, will also help you acclimate to the rhythm and flow of the language. Remember, every effort you make brings you closer to fluency, so keep practicing and stay curious.
That's such an encouraging message, George. Thank you for sharing your expertise and practical strategies with us today. I'm sure our listeners will find your insights invaluable as they work toward understanding native English speakers better.
And thank you for having me, Linda. It's always a pleasure to help learners on their journey.
That concludes today's episode of the Global English Podcast. Thank you all for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and remember that every step you take on your language journey brings you closer to fluency. See you next time.